We're really excited to have our first of two methane conversations this afternoon. We're going to start by talking about jumpstarting methane finance to realize the Global Methane Pledge, and then later on today we'll talk about implementation in the Americas. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Kait Siegel, as Senior Analyst with the Methane Pollution Prevention Team at Clean Air Task Force. As many of us here today know, emissions of methane, greenhouse gas, and short-lived climate pollutant are pushing us towards irreversible climate tipping points. Methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term, and reducing methane pollution is our best strategy to reduce the amount of global warming we'll experience in the next 20 years and to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Last year at COP26, the US, UK, and EU launched the Global Methane Pledge, an international agreement to collectively reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. To date, more than 140 countries, I believe, have joined the pledge. So, thanks. So there have already been a couple of conversations about methane at COP. Today's my first day here, but I've heard a lot of good conversations have happened. Last week, I think we talked a bit about the need for methane to be in more NDCs and in more long-term planning and goals. But for that to have an impact, investment and finance for methane projects are critical. So today, I'm joined by a wonderful panel of experts in major methane-emitting sectors, and they're going to help us identify some barriers, opportunities, and pathways to jumpstart methane finance. I'm joined today by Chavi Meattle, a senior analyst at the Climate Policy Initiative, Laurence Blandford, Vice President of Strategy Consulting, Climate Change, and ESG at WSP Canada, Rick Duke, Special Envoy for Climate Change for the United States, Dr. Stephen Hammer, Advisor for Global Climate Policy and Strategy at the World Bank Group, and Igwebuike Ijeoma, Board Member for Climate Strategies UK and Enviropreneur and CEO of Schrodinger Greentech. So I'll start by thanking everybody for being here today. Our run of show is going to be some brief remarks by all of our panelists, and then we'll launch into a panel discussion. So to start, I'd like to ask, apologies, I had slides. So to start, I'd like to ask Chavi to take the mic and talk to us a bit about the landscape of methane abatement finance. Do we have a mic? Oh, great.
Hello. Great. It's quite a pleasure to be here and talking about methane abatement finance, about a study and, kind of understand the solutions and the gaps that the sector has. So let me just provide a bit of context. We all know that methane has a warming potential 80 times over the relative to the carbon dioxide when it's at least in the first 20 years it's in the atmosphere. So definitely, sharp reduction in methane is critical. And critical to that is also the finance we receive. So what CPI did, and it was a study that was financed by Global Methane Hub, was to provide sort of first of its kind baseline to understand how much finance is sort of flowing in the sector, who are the providers, and what sectors in detail it is going to within the methane, what sector it's basically targeting. And what we did was, next slide please, and what we did was actually focus on three main sectors. One was fossil fuel, agriculture and forestry and land use, and waste, which totally accounts for 95% of the human contribution to methane. And what we saw, and the findings would be pretty stark here, that despite its outsized contribution, methane's outsized contribution to global climate change, it's only receiving 2% of the global climate finance flows. So we are talking about 10 billion when you compare the global finance flows with something around under 700 billion. And what we see, and compared to the needs, it's again falling short. We need around $120 billion to kind of, implement all the methane abatement solutions, according to one of the, I think it's an IA estimates. And if you look at it, you'll see that we are kind of falling short on all the sectors, right? And next slide, please. And this is a slide that tells you, that obviously there are other solutions out there which has a similar mitigation potential like methane, and they end up receiving more than 15 to 30% more, of 30 times more climate finance. So when we talk about comparison with a bit renewable energy, and we're talking about transport sector. So the finance is there. Where it's going, I think we need to kind of discuss about that. Next slide, please. Okay, and this can be a little overwhelming graphic, but let me just break down that for you. So I think the first slide on the left, the left pillar that you see tells you like who are the financiers, whether the public and private. And if you see majority of the finance that's flowing in the sector is coming from private actors. And they are going to more commercially viable sector like waste, if I can say so, it's commercially viable. So there's a lot of finance is actually going in there, in that particular sector. Also on the public side, you see a lot of financing from DFIs like the World Bank and other ones there, and they account for like around 13% of all the finance that we ended up tracking. And on the middle and the second and third pillar kind of shows you what regions are receiving that finance. So East Asia and Pacific, and more specifically China, is one of the major emitter, and it ends up receiving majority of the methane abatement finance. And the other two major, like second or third major emitters, we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, which is actually just attracted 6% of the methane abatement. So you kind of see, where the finance is sort of concentrated and how we need to kind of diversify that finance, right? Next slide, please. And yeah, so I mean, we definitely see, I think, one of the major sector, which is fossil fuel sector, and where abatement potential is really high. It just ended up receiving, I think, around 0.5 or less than 1% of total finance that we ended up tracking. And despite the potential of this sectors really offer, we know that if we kind of, it's technically possible. It's been shown by studies that it's technically possible to kind of reduce 75% of the emissions that happen in this sector, especially at no special net cost. There'll be benefit if you kind of tap it and kind of reuse that energy, and especially given the high prices, gas prices that we are literally seeing. So yeah, I mean, that's one sector we really need to focus as well. Next slide, please. And of course, we're going to be discussing this in detail, so that's why I'm going to keep it short here. We, of course, need more enabling environments, more regulations and policies in place that will just help us, incentivize kind of scaling up of the existing and established commercially viable technologies, but also kind of, work with to kind of figure out more investments in R&D in this sector, and kind of look at more cost-effective solutions. And then, of course, private sector especially, but of course even public actors, both financial institutions as well as the corporates, needs to kind of have a more detailed plan on net zero goals, in their net zero transition plans, etc. And the third point is, of course, data and reporting. I mean, you've seen the data is out there as patchy, and we'll hear a bit also from other panelists how it is. So I think we need to start focusing on measuring and, sort of reporting on those in the sector, and, trying to understand, get in more detail where the sector financing is flowing. So I'll stop here. Hopefully I've kept it concise, Kait. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chavi. So now that we know how little methane finance is actually getting out there and how much we sort of feel that we need, I'm going to pass the mic to Laurence, who's going to talk to us a little bit about barriers to getting that out the door and implementing these projects on the ground.
Everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is work that was done. Okay, I think this is better. There we go. So this is based on some work that our firm did with CATF, just exactly to identify sort of barriers, gaps and barriers in the methane finance space. So what is it on the supply side and on the demand side that is preventing methane finance from flowing at scale. We can go to the slide. So obviously, the vision here is even more ambitious than the pledge. Clearly, we want to reduce methane as much as possible to achieve very ambitious reductions by 2030. Obviously, climate finance is a big piece of that. How do you encourage funders to prioritize methane mitigation in what they're allocating? And where are there areas where you can enhance national capacity to regulate methane, price methane, and access finance for methane projects? Next slide. Obviously, a lot of methane reductions are very cost effective. 30% of reductions to achieve the goals that we're talking about actually are have net negative costs, so there's a cost benefit to doing them, and a number of them are very low cost, very low marginal cost. So methane reductions are relatively cheap, but next slide, they're relatively hard to do, and that's kind of the challenge, right? And there's a number of reasons there, and so there are some supply side constraints from the donors themselves, from the climate finance architecture. And there are some demand-side constraints in terms of what sectors and countries are doing. For example, we're not seeing necessarily donors prioritizing or tracking methane mitigation funding. Some would argue the pipeline of projects that's coming through is small and of low quality. There's obviously regulatory complexity, market complexity that makes it hard to kind of scope a large-scale project that you can bring to a funder. And there are some policy incentive questions there that obviously are worth discussing. Next slide. So, there's a lot more deep analysis, and I'm sure CATF might be willing to share some of that with others if they're asking for it. But, on the supply side, I think what we're suggesting is that obviously we really need to encourage donors to kind of be putting more money on the table to fund methane projects specifically. And also to think about how do you mainstream methane within the funding institutions. I think Stephen may be talking to us a bit more about that. There's a big need for technical assistance to help national actors come up with plans to support pipeline development. And there's room both for activity-based financing, sort of upfront money, or results-based financing, sort of paying per tons of reductions. On the countryside, obviously working to integrate methane into kind of NDC, pipelines of projects, how bringing forward methane projects to funding institutions, policy and regulatory frameworks, use of domestic budgets to really create those incentives, and really looking at the pricing of methane. This is a bit of a tricky issue, which we may get into a bit more, but obviously putting a price on something is a good way to reduce it. But you don't necessarily want it to be entirely fungible, say within a national carbon market with CO2, because there may be some inappropriate trade-offs that could occur there. Another thing that's not on this slide, but that has come up, which I'll sort of throw out there, is that we have heard a little bit, there also is a little bit of negotiation politics that get in the way with this, because the methane reductions are rather inexpensive. Then some donors would sort of say, well, those are the ones that you should do, in your unconditional targets as opposed to seeking donor money. My attitude on that is, and I'm a former negotiator, my attitude on that is there's a climate emergency, we have to get reductions done quickly, this is low-hanging fruit, park the politics on it and fund the reductions. Next slide. So obviously some ideas here around what kind of funding could be allocated. Eventually, maybe talking about specific facilities. I'm never necessarily one who thinks that creating a new fund or facility is the solution, but sometimes it can help because it creates a point of contact for people, something they can kind of access directly. Lots of opportunities here for the funding that's already been provided by donors to strengthen action here, and obviously the more that can be done in partnership, the more I think we'll see some action on the ground. That's it. Happy to get into it more.
Thank you, Laurence, and I guess we'll play hot potato with the mic for the rest of the session. And thank you for teeing up our next two panelists so very, very well. So now I'll pass this off to Rick to talk to us about what the U.S. is trying to do and its leadership role on the methane problem.
Thanks all for joining and paying attention to this crucial topic today. Not just last year in Glasgow, but today we have to keep the pressure on this topic, and it's good to see that people are still interested. Last year, we mobilized over 100 countries to endorse and support the collective goal to cut methane pollution at least 30% by 2030, the bare minimum of what IPCC tells us is needed to keep a safer 1.5 degrees centigrade future within reach. I'm happy to say that it is true that this year, a year later, we now are 140 countries supporting the Global Methane Pledge and counting, and we are not stopping there. Also want to note that 90% of governments in the world account for and include methane in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement architecture. We need to see all countries account for and include methane in their net greenhouse gas emission targets using the Paris Agreement architecture that we've all agreed upon to deal with the fact that methane in the atmosphere right now is causing a half a degree centigrade of the net 1.2 degrees centigrade that we're already suffering from so poignantly in Pakistan and worldwide with heat waves and the wildfire that comes with that, etc. So there's no faster way to pump the brakes on climate change than to cut methane, and we cannot be serious about the goals of the Paris Agreement, even holding temperature well below 2C, let alone keeping 1.5 as a serious topic, requires that we deliver on the Global Methane Pledge together at a minimum. And all countries need to put their oar in the water and be a part of making that happen, especially major emitters. So good to see that we have attention still on this issue and building, and we need to keep at it and keep the pressure on it. I want to just talk a little bit about the CPI report that was just so helpfully summarized. It's both a challenge, obviously, that less than 2% of climate finance is going into this crucial topic when it's half a degree centigrade of today's climate change that's at stake. But of course, that's also an opportunity. It's a real opportunity for us to remedy this with some of the work that you've done and with the work that we're seeking to do more broadly. Let me just talk a little bit about how the United States is trying to rise to that cause. In terms of our own domestic action, we are moving in the United States economy to act to cut methane pollution, both the regulatory levers. We just passed a fee on oil and gas methane, rising quickly to $60 a ton of CO2 equivalent on our oil and gas methane. And we just put a new rule out with lots of creative and strong oil and gas standards, including a role for individuals to track and help to enforce emissions in oil and gas sector as a key innovation in that rule. And our U.S. Department of Agriculture just put $500 million into methane-specific programs through the Climate Smart Commodities Program. And there are literally billions coming in terms of domestic investment in orphaned oil and gas, well remediation, coal mine remediation, agricultural methane programs, and the like. So we're acting at home. We're also seeking to scale institutions that can deliver on the Global Methane Pledge. So we are moving towards $40 million in funding through the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, focused mainly on methane in coming years. I co-chair that on behalf of the United States government and proud to see the work they're doing on helping governments to step up and do more on methane across the board. And we're putting the funding there to make sure that it's possible for them to do that work. We've been working with Global Philanthropy. Global Philanthropy stepped up and put a crucial $50 million in play just in time for us to deliver the Kigali Amendment on a different non-CO2 gas back in 2016. And they stepped up in an even bigger way with $350 million for methane action last year that helped us, was really crucial to getting the Global Methane Pledge secured and now to do that work. And then we, the United States government, are seeking to, wherever possible, get more into the international bloodstream as well and to methanize the work of institutions like the African Development Bank and the World Bank and others. As an example of that, and just a down payment on that intention, we put $5 million into the Africa Development Bank in a trust fund to help with project preparation and other kind of early stage work to build up the pipeline of projects at a much larger scale in AFDB. And thankfully, the philanthropy methane hub matched that with aligned funding of a similar magnitude. And we're not done with that conversation. Finally, I just want to make clear that methane action has many co-benefits. this group probably knows this, but let's just make sure. When you cut methane pollution, it means that you're also cutting a key precursor for tropospheric ozone, and that, of course, is increasingly one of the most severe public health pollutants. It's also harming agricultural productivity, so the major co-benefits from just acting on methane, yes, as a climate imperative, but also for these other reasons. And much of the work that we can and must do to, and let's just be clear, stepping back, it's good that we have all this attention, good that we have these institutions now in place, good that everyone's trying harder, but the trend right now is dire. Methane pollution globally is not on a track to 30% reductions by 2030, not even close. Methane pollution, according to a new CCAC baseline report, is actually slated to increase about 10% by 2030. So we have our work cut out for us. I also want to note briefly in terms of institutions, in addition to the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, we're also supporting the European Commission and others in the measurement endeavors of the International Methane Emissions Observatory, a good opportunity to take advantage of all the emerging remote sensing and overflight and in situ data, stitch it all together and have more clarity about where the emissions are so that we can act on them together. Finally, I just want to be clear on these co-benefits. There's the ozone co-benefit, the tropospheric ozone co-benefit to public health. But then there are many things that can be done that are essentially development imperatives, enhancing agricultural productivity, enhancing solid waste management, that then have methane benefits as part and parcel of that work. And when we empower the World Bank and African Development Bank and others to really pay attention to that as a specific element of what they're doing in those normal development efforts on agriculture and waste management and beyond, then we can really make more happen more quickly. So I think that's exciting. And just as a quick example of that, look this week for a really exciting announcement on global dairy progress in a few days around what can be done to enhance dairy productivity as a way to build on what happened in Tanzania, where in less than a year's time, it was possible to nearly double average productivity of dairy in Tanzania, which meant a methane intensity reduction of 1/3 per liter of milk and an increase in farmer incomes as well. So huge potential there for opportunities for economic development that also cuts methane. And lastly, I'll just say, you think about the amount of work that we've all done together and our friends here on energy transition. There are thousands of national plans and World Bank plans and efforts to move faster on the energy transition. That's all entirely appropriate and necessary, and we need to complete that thought. And the only way we stabilize long-term climate is to cut CO2 by completing the energy transition and, of course, stop tropical deforestation. But we must complement that with fast mitigation, building on, by the way, the success of the hydrofluorocarbon work in the Montreal Protocol. And I note that Brazil and the United States both just ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, so we know we can get it done. Now we have to tackle methane with similar vigor and creativity. So anyway, thanks. I went on a bit long, apologies for that, but get passionate about this topic.
Thank you. No. Thank you so much, Rick. Never punish passion. And so now we're a little bit behind schedule, so I'll just pass it on to Stephen to tell us about what the World Bank is doing.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation. I mean, there's just each of the speakers so far, we could just dig into the slides, what Rick has been talking about, what CPI showed us in terms of where the money is going right now. Each of those have a story behind it. And so I'm going to talk briefly about how the World Bank Group is beginning to think about this. So Rick used the term fast mitigation, and that's something that we've been talking to the U.S. government about now for just under a year. And it is something that we've decided to step up on and show some global leadership on. And that means leadership in terms of how we're doing things operationally within bank operations and bank group operations. Let me be clear on that. So it's also private sector focus as well. But also trying to engage others in the finance community about what they can do more of to help get the money on the table so that these kinds of projects can get done. So if you're in an institution like ours, you're already working on this. You're talking about land use, you're talking about agriculture systems, you're talking about the energy sector. I personally worked on waste at the bank for several years, and in each of those areas, there was a recognition that this is a problem. We should do something about it. And, so the projects emerged. In some cases, there were specialized funds that we could tap. So there were the old Kyoto funds that different types of projects had access to. But that began to diminish over time. And as the project teams began to engage with the clients, they also began to see how the complexity of the issue really determined whether there was a strong focus on methane or whether it became one of many issues that needed to be solved simultaneously. And here is where I look at the abatement cost curve, and you try and explain why is it that it's not happening in this sector when it's just an obvious no-brainer type activity to do. But you may actually see more action in sectors where it may be more expensive. And part of it has to do with what I call the system architecture. The regulatory environment, the number of actors that you need to influence their behavior. And so if you begin to think, and one of the things that I've loved about COP this year is not just that we're continuing the methane conversation, but it's getting much, much richer. So I was at a fantastic dinner the other evening that the private sector convened, and there were some really strategic ideas that are being put on the table that we all need to think about, as we're doing this work on the ground. And so to go back to where I was heading, the fact is that if you're doing agriculture methane, you got to get individual farmers. You may be able to transform a regulatory framework for a sector, but you still have to transform the practices on the ground, the feed on the ground, for a lot of individual stakeholders. So that requires market transformation that's completely different than if you're in the energy sector and there's one company that has a lot of really lousy wells that they've not maintained that is the source of a lot of emissions. And you know exactly who to target, you know what you may need to do from a regulatory perspective, completely different system solution. And so part of what we're grappling with as we think about a fast mitigation strategy is that how you can take each sector or source and come up with a roadmap that makes sense for that, but then you begin to stitch those together across sectors and you end up with a countrywide strategy. So the methane plans that are emerging, is very exciting. It shows that governments are taking this seriously, that they're beginning to think through this systematically. And as we begin to engage as an institution, as a country office, as a project task team lead, it really benefits from strategic thinking on our side and strategic thinking on the other side, the government side. But having access to that data from the satellites, from improved modeling, showing where there's more or less money that's being spent, that's all really helpful data inputs into that conversation as well. So as part of the Sprint initiative, we've made a commitment that we're going to part of it is just let's do this, do more often. Let's just talk about this with our clients. And so when our president of the bank was having a conversation with the president of a country in Latin America, the team put talking points into the prep notes and said, make sure you raise cattle as an issue. It's not often that the president would choose to raise cattle as an issue, but we're going to do that more systematically. And it also matters when you have a new diagnostic that we call the Country Climate and Development Report, the CCDR. I hope you've been coming over to the World Bank Group Pavilion over the last week. We've been talking about these a lot. This is our new way of integrating climate into our traditional development work. And this is how we're overlaying climate impacts or opportunities on top of the development narrative or trajectory or challenges that a country has. And we then talk about whether it's going to get harder or whether it may get easier on some issues. But methane is coming up in several of these, in Vietnam, in China, in Iraq. And now we're going to, again, do that more consistently so that there's a better and deeper treatment of that issue in all of these, because we're going to do that for every single one of our clients over the 5-year period. And once we're done after 5 years, we'll do it again. And we'll take account of whether countries are living up to their methane pledge or whether they followed the roadmap that they set out. Because then we can deepen the work, refine the work, and do a lot better at making sure we're really honing in on exactly where the problem is. So again, coming out of this dinner Friday night, someone was talking about not all oil wells or oil fields are the same, and that some are actually the source of the vast majority of the emissions. And so if you have better tracking and you have a better conversation with the counterpart, you know exactly where you want to focus your efforts. So that's how we're thinking about this. I was hoping Rick was going to show up with a big check, but you know, that's for another day. But look, we really appreciate the encouragement and the cooperation with the U.S. and others who have been supporting the Methane Pledge, because it's helping all of us do better development work, and it's going to help all of us do better in terms of addressing the climate imperative that I think everybody has already recognized, but we've also already spoken about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're getting good at this mic passing. So our last speaker for today, before we move to our panel discussion, is Igwebuike Ijeoma, and he's going to provide us with some of the African and Nigerian perspective on actually financing and getting these projects moving on the ground.
Thank you, Kait. So I'm happy to be here. And so, you know, jumpstarting methane finance to realize the Global Methane Pledge. I think the gap here from the work we do, I'm from Nigeria, and you know, we've done a lot of work, is actually we have to look at SDG 17, you know, partnership for the goals. A lot of that is not happening, especially in Africa, especially in Nigeria, and there's also this part, not the part less traveled, and that's the sub-national government, which is where we are, you know, focusing now. A lot of the World Bank and, you know, RICS, you know, a lot of the attention is on national government, but that's fine. But then, you know, sometimes from our experience, we discover that national government sometimes can be very, very, a lot of inefficiency, maybe because of the size, you know, huge bureaucracy and all of that. But if you come down a step lower to the sub-national government, and you know that in a country like Nigeria, and I think that applies to every other country, the environment and climate issues are actually on the concurrent list of the Constitution. So the sub-national government can actually engage, make legislation and all of that on those issues. So if we have the right, what is missing is the right constellation of partners, you know, and I would really want to challenge us, you know, if we talk about this and, you know, set a target for us to come back next year, you know, the next COP, to showcase what this, you know, the people coming here, what the, some kind of an outcome, you know, some kind of legacy of this engagement, because sometimes I get worried that we talk, you know, much more than we don't walk the talk. So going by the work we've done in Nigeria, I think we have to look more at the subnational government. And we understand what needs to happen there. A lot of investment in knowledge management has to go in. A lot of investment in, you know, for instance, we have what we call the climate investment framework, which the subnational government can legislate on. And then we have the business model, which brings in the private sector to really lead on this. So if we are going to close this gap, and if we are going to get Africa to join East Asia and the Pacific, from your slide there, where the money, the little money, that's where it's going. Then we can begin to see that in the next, by 2030, we should have Africa, you know, come up on that list of where the money is going. Then I think that's really, really where we need to be looking, subnational government, and getting the right constellation of partners to really begin to look beyond the national government and see what opportunities exist at the subnational government for us to get this going. So we had, for example, we had a project last year. One of the subnational governments, we presented a new business model to them, because most of the governments, most of the state governments in the West is a huge issue, right? It's a big, big problem in Nigeria, and I know in other parts of Africa. So we approached them, we came up with this business model and say, hey, we can really get the burden of the investment you are making off you, after what we call a transition, 3-4 years transition period. Because again, if you look at the political economy of some of these countries, for instance, in Nigeria, we're going to be going to election next year. The public sector has always tried to handle methane mitigation projects, or waste management, or, they've always tried to handle that, but they lack the capacity. They lack also the knowledge and also the technology, the innovative technology required, and also the investment. And if we are going to bring in the private sector to say, you can outsource this to the private sector, we are going to set up pipeline of methane mitigation projects, which are actually, we could pay for themselves and generate value for us, the stakeholders. And, they saw reasons with that, and we tried to pilot it, but they missed something which we told them to do, and that is the legislation. Now, in the last 1 year, everybody's talking about the next election, so the state governors and the politicians are involved in politicking. But then if we have a framework or some kind of arrangement that gets the private sector to lead, and also the communities that are suffering most from where these waste problems are, then we would have taken that and ensured taking that away from the government. They have a skin in the game. They have some equity in those vehicles that will be set up to address these issues. And we think that succeeded to some point, but then what was lacking was the legislation, the climate investment framework that we need to lock this in. So a lot of the resources that people who wanted to invest, didn't see that happen. And then, so there are about 36 more states where, we can do this, and then use one state as a pilot and get the stakeholders here to come on board, and then we'll come back here next COP to showcase the progress we've made with one, subnational government. I think that is really where the gap is and how we can move forward in walking the talk. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say very briefly in response, if I could, I'll be very quick, that I want to recognize government of Nigeria for having just moved on oil and gas methane regulations, which is a wonderful step. I want to note that more broadly, Egypt just committed as part of a big renewables push where they're going to do 35 gigawatts of new renewables and put it in their NDC next year. They're also going to work on oil and gas methane with us, and there's a lot of opportunity in broader North Africa context on that front. And thank you to Nigeria for leading the way on oil and gas methane, which is in and of itself a 1/10 of a degree centigrade opportunity on climate. And I wanted to connect with you afterwards because we've just announced with Bloomberg Philanthropy some action on subnational landfill methane, where I think we should talk about what we could do together on that front.
Thank you so much. So thank you to everybody here so far for those brief remarks. And now we'll move into our panel discussion portion of our session for 15-20 minutes or so. So I want to highlight, we've talked a little bit about tracking today, whether that's satellites, I think, Stephen, you mentioned, for tracking emissions and reductions. But there's also an important piece about tracking for finance. So in CPI's Landscape of Methane Finance Assessment report, you all proposed a taxonomy for tracking of methane finance. And I wanted to ask you, Chavi, why that's important and how CO2 or finance tracking has helped in the carbon dioxide space, and how can we view that as a lesson for methane?
No, that's a great question. So definitely, I think this was the first kind of assessment. So we wanted to understand what solutions, what technologies are considered as eligible for methane methane abatement finance. And this is a conversation we've been having even with climate finance definition. What constitutes, we're still discussing it after so many years as well. So I think that's, from that perspective, it's important to understand how we're defining methane abatement solutions. And that's some point that you also flagged about, when we talk about pledges and commitments, how we follow through them, and they need to have enough credibility and accountability And that's really, trying to understand what the taxonomy, takes into account the solutions that will add in more and more accountability to that aspect. So what we looked at in terms of taxonomy, and this is like a utopian world, it all depends on data that we get reported from the financial institutions. But what we looked at is like a two-tier system. One was trying to understand the direct effects of some project solutions that are directly affecting methane abatement. So think about livestock feeds, which is kind of doing methane emissions directly, or you think about indirect solutions. So think about low carbon meat diet, and kind of promoting those awareness around that. So that was the first tier, but that doesn't tell you the value and the impact and of those measures. So the second tier becomes important, where we're trying to understand what are the technical solutions. So I'm talking, when I say technical solution, I'm talking about the changes that are introduced in your processes, your materials, your machines. And then there was the second distinction is also understanding enabling environment, right? So what sort of legislations are you introducing? What sort of financing are you spending on those? That kind of help you better effectuate or better implement the technical solutions. And this sort of understanding is important. And of course, you talk about CCDR, including like those climate information and trying to understand, so that those aspects sort of becomes a little important to get that disaggregated information, because then you can clearly identify, who adds what value add in terms of the capital they bring. And of course, with varying sectors, whether you talk about AFLU or waste or fossil fuels, the financials will sort of vary across actors. So we just need to find out who adds the best value based on sort of this assessment that can help you.
Thank you so much. That mic is definitely really dead. All right. So from here, I want to go back to you, Laurence. And you mentioned this like really briefly. It was like a teaser in your presentation. But can we talk about carbon markets a little bit and pricing for methane? Like what role they have to play in funding mitigation? And then you talked about this a little bit, but the play or the trade-off between carbon dioxide and methane and avoiding that?
Sure. So thanks, Kait, for the question. I think it's a really important issue because obviously pricing is critical, right? I mean, we've seen how impactful carbon pricing, carbon trading can be, particularly under a cap, to drive reductions that are in an efficient way. And I think there's a great deal of value of putting a price on methane. So Rick just talked about a methane fee in the United States. And other ways to go about that, and I think it would be sort of a natural assumption to make that therefore we should be making sure that methane is covered in trading systems and pricing systems, or provided as a compliance opportunity for CO2 targets, and that's true, but there are some risks there, right? Because if you provide sort of full flexibility for for CO2 to be traded with methane, say within a cap and trade system, or if you provide methane, offsets as an opportunity, as a way to kind of demonstrate compliance against the CO2 target, you may be creating a bit of a wrong trade-off around, the urgency of methane reduction, and sort of substituting that, using a methane reduction as an offset for a CO2 reduction, and then delaying the long-term reductions that you need on CO2. So it's important to think within a system that you create an incentive for both to occur. I mean, there's technical design issues there that obviously would depend on the system and what it covers, but it's just an important note, right, that you have to be careful about that question. And I'm not sure that all systems that have provided these offset opportunities have thought about those kinds of things. While I have the mic, if it's okay with you, there's one thing I want to throw out there or emphasize. And maybe just if we can put up the CPI slide up again that had the total need. The reason I want to go there is because maybe the one before, yeah, exactly. So I believe here, yes. So the next one, yeah, that one. So 44 billion needed annually for waste. 43.2 billion needed annually for FOLU, and 31 billion or so needed annually for oil and gas or fossil fuels. Now, some of that, of course, will be privately financed, but just think of the rule of thumb about what you need for project development assistance. 1 to 2%, right? I don't know, Stephen, you may have different estimates in the World Bank, but call it 1%. So what is 1% of that? That would mean you would need $400 million a year in project development support to get these projects unlocked just in the waste sector. So this is a perfect, that's true across the climate finance architecture and climate finance generally. There's a dearth of projects that are ready to be financed. Good projects attract money, and so what a great way to affect, methane reductions is to really step up support for two national governments, subnational governments, private sector actors to come up with projects that are finance ready, and those will get much more likely to get funded, and it's a way to accelerate the flows. Now, others will maybe disagree with me, but just think about the scale there, right? So the methane pledge is fantastic. I just encourage people to keep more and more there, particularly in that early stage upstream stuff, because it's hugely catalytic. Thank you for.
Yeah, yes. More money needed, but it's more complicated than that when you're talking about the waste sector, because one of the things, and this is something that my colleagues who are engaging with subnational authorities on their solid waste management problem are emphasizing again and again and again today, that whereas 20 years ago, 10 years ago, we might have focused more narrowly on a methane project at a bad landfill, today, everybody wants a comprehensive system solution. They want a better collection network. They want a diversion program for their recyclables and their organics. They want an off-taker market for all of that stuff so that they can get the revenue. They want an effective collection system that doesn't put the small, the informal sector completely out of business, even though you may have greater cost efficiency by having a certain kind of technology. So they're looking for the comprehensive system solution. And so even if we got that 1% and it was $440 million, the solution that we're trying to solve is a lot more complicated. And so we actually may do fewer projects in that sector compared to if we went to another sector. And that is what I'm talking about, why you need a sector or a source roadmap, because it's going to introduce those system design or architecture complexities that you're going to have to account for. And then you come up with how we're going to target methane out of all of that messiness. And then you can compare that sector against another and say, you know what? The lower hanging fruit is over here. And that's the kind of comprehensive strategy that we're trying to move towards and is absolutely necessary when we're dealing, with a government that could pick one of 5 sources of methane, nationally. Which one do they really want to go for today?
We have a lot of waste people on this panel, which was accidental, actually. But going off what you were just talking about, Stephen, I'm interested, Igwebuike, in how you think subnational governments can contribute to those larger plans for the sectors, because especially in the waste sector, that's where all of the work is going to happen. Does that make sense?
At the subnational level, like I said, the waste sector is very complicated. And it took us more than about a decade to be able to come up with the business model that we talked about. Maybe we don't have enough time. We have a 10-minute documentary on that. Maybe I'll have to share that later. But then it's really creating the incentives, right, for the state governments. Again, for them to see that investment in waste management is also investment in water, sanitation, hygiene, right? For instance, in Nigeria, we still have cholera outbreaks because of inefficient, unsustainable waste management. So if they see the full picture and not just the narrow, landfill activity or solid waste activity, then they are going to be moved to take action. Again, they also need to be incentivized. For instance, the project development cost, because each time you approach them, they are looking at the cost, and they are not seeing where the incentive is coming from. But then, if we put together a program that really presents where the incentives are, and they can see them, those incentives, then they are going to move, because we are trying to take the burden off their shoulders. they still treat waste management as sanitation issue and not development issue, and it's strictly some kind of sustainable business. So that our model is very comprehensive. For instance, in the state that we piloted it, because of the elections, that's no activity there. The politicians are not, they are much more involved in their stake in the getting re-election and all of that. But then we can come back to them and say, hey, we can do this. This is where the incentives are, to provide incentives for them to get the legislation needed. And again, we are also looking at getting there, because they have waste management agencies that just collect waste and have waste collectors. But then we want to get them to regulate. By the time they have the legislation, the waste management agencies will now be transformed into waste regulation, and then bring in the private sector to play that role, and bring in investors, because it's a PPP that has SPVs to begin to drive those as a business.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah. So we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. So Rick, really quickly before we finish up, I want to ask you, we've talked a lot about bringing people together and getting the right groups in the room. So what about a methane finance coalition? Is the U.S. thinking about this sort of thing and trying to bring people together, governments, international finance institutions, the other stakeholders we need? Do we need a formal place to be having these conversations?
Thank you. I think what I will promise is both specific attention on this theme and as much action as possible on this theme, and also we will not create another standing body to do anything if we don't have to, because everybody's busy, everybody's racing to try to rise to the need for faster action on methane finance, on methane standards and regulations, on methane action across the board, and we have to stick to, of course, all the work to be done on energy transition and global deforestation while we're at it. So I don't think we'll be launching a new forum per se unless somebody pushes me to do so, but there's no question that we need to have that conversation, and I think we can do it in an ad hoc fashion as well as any other standing forum would allow. But I'm always available to have that discussion, and we're not done with the kind of work that we did with the African Development Bank on trying to get some of this project preparation funding in place to really get the billions flowing. Also, I want to just note on a note of optimism that the very fact that waste and EFOLU, let's say waste and agriculture, are core development agendas for the World Bank Group or the African Development Bank or bilateral aid agencies. And I should say, by the way, we are also putting investment into methanizing U.S. Agency for International Development, and we welcome other sister institutions on a bilateral basis doing the same thing. The fact that we're talking here about core development imperatives around better waste management for solid waste and for sewage, better agricultural productivity, and for that matter, even energy security. All of those things then have their own logic, their own project preparation support mechanisms. And so the picture is grim in terms of methane-specific finance, but also if we kind of methanize some of the core work of the MDBs and the bilateral aid agencies, we can get a long way on that basis alone. So we can be as catalytic as possible in that regard.
Thank you so much. Ending on a note of optimism is always a good thing. So we've talked a lot today, and I just want to summarize with 3 key themes that I saw in all of our conversations. The first being that we need to keep the pressure on for methane and methane finance. So doing everything within our power and funding all projects, not just the low-hanging fruit or the particularly difficult ones, like the point you made, Laurence, when you were speaking. And we need to be creative about it. How do we get this money moving quickly in the window that we have before 2030? We need to track whether that's emissions and getting a better understanding of methane emissions in these key sectors today, tracking reductions and having, I don't think we mentioned the term MRV here today, but having great MRV frameworks for each of these sectors so we can track those projects and programs. And then also, like Chavi was mentioning, also tracking the finance flows themselves. And then finally, we might not need a formal forum for talking about this, but we need to keep these conversations going about methane finance so that we get these projects out the door as quickly as possible. Fast mitigation seems to be the term that we're hearing this COP for methane and other short-lived climate pollutants. And speed seems to be the name of the game. And that can only happen if we're getting everyone together to have these conversations. So again, I want to thank all of my wonderful panelists today for being here and sharing their perspectives. And thank you all for joining us. Again, we have another methane conversation in a half an hour on action to implement the methane pledge in the Americas. It's going to be great. So please stick around if you have the time. Thank you.